I recently retired, and I always said that, once I retired from the history department at Dalhousie, I would cease studying far-flung places like Vancouver and Ottawa and become a Nova Scotia historian. So this is, I guess, my beginning in this project, along with the work that I've been doing at King's and Dalhousie on the early history of slavery and the administration of universities in this province. Anyway, so that's why I haven't paid the membership dues. All of you. I'm happy to introduce tonight the speaker of our Phyllis R. Blakely Memorial Lecture. Sara Hollett has an undergraduate degree in Atlantic Canada Studies and History from St. Mary's University, and completed her master's degree in public history at Carleton. Now, Carleton has really become a powerhouse in this field of public history, the field where we study how the work of researchers and scholars is presented in myriad ways through museums and publicity materials of the sort Sarah's talking about tonight. So she's really gotten her degree from one of the best places now offering that kind of training in Canada. And Carleton University, a place that's long had a connection to Nova Scotia history through Del Muse. Professionally, she's also known to many people, I think, in the room through the Council of Nova Scotia Archives, where she's an archives advisor, through Pier 21, where she has worked at the Canadian Museum of Immigration, Library Archives Canada, and Parks Canada. Checking my notes, make sure I haven't left anything out. No, that's the professional career. So to speak about the new Nova Scotia provincial tourism, history, and identity, 1956 to 1966, I give you Sara Hollett.
So to turn the microphone on, is the button on the left right here? Yep. Did I turn it off?
Uh-oh.
Can everybody hear me okay? Good? Yeah? Okay. Thanks, Shirley. That's true. Carleton has become a powerhouse, and I'm happy to have gotten my degree from Carleton. And this is all based on my master's research, which I finished in 2017, and I've had this saved in my calendar since September 2017. So it's been 2 years in the making, but really happy to be here. Just on Dr. Blakely, I never knew Dr. Blakely, never had the pleasure. She passed away, would have been 6 years before I was born. But she was a wonderful mentor to my mother, Darlene Bryan, who, as a young archivist here in an undetermined decade at the Nova Scotia Archives, Dr. Blakely was one of her mentors, and I'm sure that Dr. Blakely would be really happy to learn that Darlene's daughter has followed in her worthy footsteps. So the photograph here that I wanted to start with may look familiar to some people. I think it's been similar versions that you may have seen. Kind of looks like a stock photograph, and in some cases it is, but the people in the walkway there under the apple orchard are actually my grandparents. So it's from a collection that was kept by my grandfather, who was a photographer for the Nova Scotia Travel Bureau, which among lots of other names over the years would eventually become the Department of Tourism in 1971. The photographer for this photograph, as I always like to mention, is unknown. So the photographs that my grandfather collected were family photos, there was baby pictures, Christmas photos, but then there was also these series of really beautiful photos that probably were taken on assignment. Some were definitely taken by him, or stamped by him, others were taken by a colleague, presumably. So he worked for the Information Service Department, which was responsible for promotional photographs and films. And like I said, my grandfather and grandmother are featured in a few of the tourism brochures from the time period that I'll be talking about. So it's very special to me, and partly, largely, what inspired this research for my MA in public history, which Shirley mentioned I finished in 2017. Also comes from sort of an early on fascination with Ian Mackay's Quest for Folk. I remember reading it in my first year at a Canada Studies course and wondering what happened after World War II. So this is kind of where this all has come from. And I find it so interesting to look at all these old photographs and think of my grandfather. It's really kind of cool to see my grandparents my age, maybe even younger, with children, in the late 1950s in these brochures. And it's given me a lot of context for the research, a personal connection, which I think we all sort of must maintain to our research. I don't know there's that many historians who can say that they're not genuinely interested and personally connected to what they study. So my grandfather's personal and professional photography reflected many of the new themes in the advertising in this time period, which we're going to talk all about. Like I mentioned, the collection was in his possession, and it's a mix of family photos and images that may or may not have been taken on assignment. I've indicated in the photos that I've put into the presentation, I've indicated which ones he was the photographer for. And the ones that he didn't, just as a photographer, is unknown. Tony, can you hear me okay?
I think it might actually be off.
Is it off?
Yeah, I don't know what's
Is it on now? I think I might have turned it off when I started.
Let's hit the one.
sound check.
Did everybody hear what I said? Okay.
That's much better, Sarah.
Is that better?
Yes,
Okay.
thank
I was
you.
sort of not really hearing myself, but I thought maybe
Just have to keep it in front of your,
my
yeah,
imagination.
That's it.
Everyone can hear me now?
Yes.
So I wanted to also start with kind of a funny story that my dad used to tell me, who's here in the audience here with my family, that his father told him. Among the Travel Bureau photographers, it was a commonplace joke that if you were shooting a fishing scene, Sobeys was the best grocery store to get fish that would look the best in photos. By the way, my grandfather's name was Sara Hollett, who is, this was unknown because I don't know he was the photographer, so that won't appear in the credits. Anyway, this is a great illustration of the arguments that I'm going to be presenting to you tonight. That tourism promoters in Nova Scotia in the 1950s and 60s knew exactly the history they were selling, they realized that they were selling it, and it was more than just history, but an invented past that was consumable and marketable. Not necessarily bad words, but different than earlier. I also argue that the 1962 hiring of Dalton K. Camp and Associates, which I'm going to refer to as DKCA, was a major turning point in the professionalization of the tourism industry in Nova Scotia. So under various names, the Nova Scotia Travel Bureau had existed within the provincial government since the 1920s. In 1925, tourism was first integrated into the provincial government, before it had been sort of led by industry members, and became known as the Bureau of Information, later the Tourist and Information Bureau, had a lot of names, as most provincial government departments. It was most often associated with departments dealing with economic development, but it was also at one point housed in the Public Health Department, presumably following a minister who switched departments. In 1941, tourism became one half of the new Department of Industry and Publicity, and was later named to the renamed to the Department of Trade and Industry. By the early 1960s, the Bureau itself was renamed to the Nova Scotia Travel Bureau, which I'll use as its main name. This was what it was called during the time period that I'll be talking about, and for simplicity. And also a separate information service division was created, which is the department that my grandfather was hired in the early 1950s. The Nova Scotia Information Service reported to the Travel Bureau and took all of the photos and videos created by the Bureau. And the Department of Tourism itself was not established until 1971 and would later become the Department of Tourism, Culture and Heritage. In 2015, tourism was transferred to Tourism Nova Scotia, which is a Crown corporation. The photo on the left, which is an unknown photographer, is actually a group shot of the Travel Bureau employees at a Christmas party, presumably, because it's a Christmas tree, and a tuna, I think, is the background, in the probably mid to late 1950s. And if anyone, I know a few of the faces, but if anybody recognizes some faces, let me know. My grandfather is in the back there, in the middle row, behind the Christmas tree, and in the middle row, on the second there, behind sort of those two people, is Margaret Perry, who was a producer for the Bureau. So if anybody recognizes any other faces, let me know. You can let me know right now if you want.
Second from left, right? I don't think you said.
Yes.
Yeah, Margaret Perry is on my right, on the second in, and my grandfather is in the top row in the middle. So as I began the research back in 2015, I found a story of change and modernization in the department. As I mentioned, in 1962, the Bureau hired Dalton K. Camp and Associates to design and distribute tourism ads in major Canadian and American magazines like Life, The New Yorker, and National Geographic, among many others. DKCA, as you may have guessed, was formed by Dalton Camp in 1959. After Camp's time as president and owner of Dalton K. Camp and Associates Limited, he became the national president of the Progressive Conservative Party in 1964. Then went on to lead the political advertising for none other than Nova Scotia Premier Robert Stanfield's successful 1967 campaign for leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, and was later senior advisor to Brian Mulroney. Dalton Camp and his brother-in-law Norman Akins, who also worked with the agency, were the architects of the Big Blue Machine and the PC Party's success in the second half of the 20th century. So the story is not just about tourism, but also about politics. DKCA was well known for doing government work in the 1960s. They successfully managed many provincial political campaigns and were often hired to handle government advertising accounts after the win. They even were the ones who coined the term "Yours to Discover," slogan for Ontario in the 1980s. In 1992, DKCA was sold and became A. Smith McIntyre Wick. I'm not sure exactly how to say it. And then it was rebranded in 2008 as Agency 59, complete with a retro 59 logo in their design, which you can see on the right there. That's a screenshot from the Wayback Machine from June 12, 2008, when they rebranded the company. And as you can see, it reads, "Welcome." Oh, it doesn't quite say that, but on the website in 2008, the quote that I'm going to read, "Welcome to 1959. We began at a time when there was a premium on curiosity, invention, enthusiasm, and trust. 1959, it's in our DNA." As we'll see in the early 1960s, DKCA did actually bring new curiosity and invention to the province in its advertising. The Travel Bureau had hired earlier companies to manage aspects of their advertising, but on a much smaller scale. The first advertising agency. The first advertising agency to be hired was called Mandeville Press Bureau from New York City in 1935. And they put advertisements in newspapers, magazines, as well as radio. In 1940, Nova Scotia became the first province to air publicity on American TV, and in the same year, a large ad appeared in National Geographic. After and during the Second World War, despite the challenges of wartime, tourism promoters
The escape key.
It's because my paper is resting on the. So yeah, during and after the Second World War, despite challenges of wartime, tourism promoters understood that placing high-quality advertisements in American markets was really the future of Nova Scotia advertising. In 1946, Kelly Nason Incorporated, another advertising agency out of New York City, was hired to handle Nova Scotia's advertising. So I'm just kind of giving you a sort of context of the leading up of the hiring of Dalton K. Camp and Associates. Kelly Nason planned advertising programs, newspapers, magazines. They ran the New York travel office, which was operated out of their offices, put on the International Tuna Cup match every year. Between 1946 and 47, travel offices in New York and Boston had opened, and like I mentioned, the New York office was run by Kelly Nason in their offices. When DKCA took over advertising in 1962, they became the first Canadian advertising agency to promote Nova Scotia. While the Travel Bureau continued to create films, publications, guidebooks, they also operated the information service and recorded statistical information on cars entering the province. DKCA did all the major advertising in Canada and America. They managed the Travel Bureau offices as well, one in New York, and a Toronto office that opened in 1962 at the same time that they were hired. In 1963, DKCA launched a special initiative called the New Nova Scotia Campaign, where the name of the presentation comes from, to promote Nova Scotia as a family-friendly location for industrial investment. In 1963, that campaign placed 12 ads, each in the New Yorker as well as Time Canada. By 1960, the Travel Bureau had already committed to increasing its efforts to attract tourists to the region. But the arrival of DKCA in 1962 represented the key step toward professionalization of tourism promotion. Looking forward to their second year of advertising in 1963, they wrote in their advertising plan, which is held here at the Nova Scotia Archives, we are making a calculated effort to trade up the tourist image of Nova Scotia by using better media to reach better customers, who will contribute more profit to your industry. At the same time, tourism promotion was going through three major changes in significant areas. More money was invested into advertising in major American magazines, hence more ads were being placed in American magazines. They also did more background research, market research into their advertising markets that they were looking to hit. DKCA's media recommendations for 1963 were to achieve maximum impact in all media and all markets through maximum size, color, and frequency. Of course, this all required much more financial investment. In the advertising season of 1963, DKCA had a budget of $210,000 for U.S. advertising, which included the new Nova Scotia campaign. The budget covered 23 color and black and white ads in major magazines like National Geographic, Holiday, The New Yorker, Life, Saturday Evening Post, and TV Guide. Comparatively, in 1946, Kelly Mason had a budget of only $16,000 on American magazines, and in 1949, a budget of $65,000 for American and Canadian ads and the operation of the New York office. In those years, they were placing ads in smaller magazines with only 8 to 10 in each major magazine. In the advertising season of 1961, the year before DKCA started, the Travel Bureau spent $155,210 on American advertising, which was only $55,000 less than the next year. So, all that to say that DKCA spent more money than earlier efforts, but it was clear that the increase was part of an already high yearly trend. Each year they went up like a significant amount. In the 12 years before DKCA was hired, between 1949 and 61, the amount spent on American advertising had risen almost 10 times its original amount in 1949. Clearly, tourism was on the rise. I also mentioned that DKCA did significantly more market research. Kelly Mason worked for the Travel Bureau until DKCA started, but they're mentioned less and less in the reports, starting in about 1953. So it's not clear if the Travel Bureau becomes more hands-on, but at any rate, DKCA included qualitative research reports more so than the Bureau or other agencies had done in earlier years. So before DKCA was hired, the reports rarely talk about ad placement studies, more advanced methods. What really just wasn't a priority. The main strategy for analysis in ad effectiveness and ad placement was studying the return rate and location return from coupons that were included in clippings. People would have them sent back to Nova Scotia. So that was the main way that they gathered an understanding of who was interested in Nova Scotia and how effective their ads were, which is good, but it's not as detailed as it could be. The information was used to generate a list of top 10 regions for placing ads. In 1951, they did some geographic index figures for population, travel potential, income groups from the locations where the coupons were returned. So that gave them a better understanding of where Nova Scotia was of interest, where to continue or stop placing ads. All this to say that in 1962, DKCA started using more advanced methods, technologies. The Daniel Starch readership service, which I couldn't really find anything about today. I don't know if it still really is a thing, but was used to measure effectiveness of ads. The service recorded the percentage of people who saw an ad about Nova Scotia and the percentage of their involvement with the ad. The categories were noted, someone who remembered seeing the ad, seen associated, someone who saw and remembered that it was about Nova Scotia, and read most, someone who saw the ad, knew it was about Nova Scotia, and could remember at least half of the ad's content. So it's obviously more advanced and a lot more qualitative than recording the number of people who returned a coupon, as I've been doing in previous years. DKCA also did studies of marketship performance, readership of national magazines, instead of relying solely on geographical index figures based on the return of coupons. So they were looking more specifically at who was reading the magazine and what their background was. They used similar index figures like median income, travel potential, but also they started to do sort of more qualitative things, more detailed, like who owned a car, who had a college education, really trying to figure out who was the right socioeconomic class to draw to Nova Scotia. They also considered market performance of chosen magazines, noting drops or increases in sales, and what other advertisers were saying about the magazines they were interested in. The Travel Bureau itself had been collecting qualitative data from incoming tourists earlier than background research for advertisements. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Travel Bureau counted the number of cars entering the province and where they came from. In 1956, the Bureau collected some qualitative data coming directly from tourists at an auto exit interview, which was conducted in 1956 by Arthur D. Little Consultants. The interview asked why tourists were visiting Nova Scotia, such as to visit friends, relatives, general vacation, how long they were staying, what they did, how much money they spent, and any other general comments. Those results brought about statistical improvements in 1957, such as not counting New Brunswick commuters in the car statistics, which apparently was throwing off the numbers. They continued to use, DKCA continued to use the older stats that were gathered by the Travel Bureau, and those stats continued to be used by the department all the way into the 1970s and 80s, going back to the time of the Second World War. But DKCA compared the statistics to similar statistics in Atlantic Canada, and they analyzed the changing proportions of cars, where cars were coming from, and how it was changing each year. So that was mostly about kind of the methods and advertising strategies, but the content of the advertisements in the time period was also significantly changing. Many of you may be familiar. I've got a slide here. I kind of wasn't sure. I feel like most people might be familiar with this, but it can be a little bit complicated, so I wanted to put a slide up. The term innocence is used by Ian Mackay to describe the Nova Scotia brand of anti-modernism articulated through the folk, which was used in the tourism industry and advertisements in the 1920s and 30s. Innocence operated as a form of essentialism, meaning that the true essence of the province could be distilled into a narrow range of unquestionably true representations, mainly connection to the ocean, Scottishness, history, tradition. In his landmark 1994 publication, The Quest of the Folk, Ian Mackay describes the folk as those who guarded the lore of the sea. The folk did not work in factories, coal mines, lobster canneries, or domestic service. They were rooted to the soil and to the rock-bound coast. Tourism pamphlets from the 1920s and 1930s used a narrow range of folk themes, such as the ocean, historical sites, picturesque scenery. Pamphlets included road maps and lists of places to stay, but often as some extra material attached on, and not reasons of themselves to visit Nova Scotia. The title of a 1931 tourism brochure summed up the style: history and romance cradled in scenic charm. And I have this is from the Nova Scotia Archives website. That's this pamphlet here. So, yeah, the style aesthetically is very different, but the imagery as well is also fairly different to what we're going to talk about. Many scholars have attempted to apply Mackay's study of innocence as a framework for tourism in the post-war period. But the adaptation of Mackay's argument to later time periods, as well as different areas of Atlantic Canada, is problematic because the Quest of the Folk in Mackay's argument is really looking at the folk specifically in a Nova Scotia context and as a specific response to interwar economic conditions in Nova Scotia. So I argue that Mackay's folk concepts can be compared to the post-war period, but not used as an identical framework going forward to understand tourism promotion in all areas. Beginning in the mid to late 1950s and continuing into the 1960s, provincial folk identity and history was used and seen differently in provincial tourism advertisements, especially those created by Dalton K and Associates. The Travel Bureau didn't stop using these sort of folk themes. They still used authentic folk characteristics, but more of a difference in how they were doing it to sell a product, not as sort of a form of this innocence where people sort of unquestionably, there was all these characteristics, Nova Scotia was this, was that, and things were a little bit more prescriptive. Advertisements in the period incorporated a multitude of themes in this post-war period, including history, but also industry, recreation, and modern conveniences, which were not nearly as common prior to that. The themes were used as tools to frame the present in a purposeful and diversified way, rather than the unquestionable romance and charm of the province. The Travel Bureau and its earlier agencies had already been experimenting with some similar content strategies before DKCA started, so it's sort of a larger political and cultural provincial narrative. This shift loosened the tight grip on representations that had existed before the Second World War. Tourism promoters were commodifying history, and history was intended to be consumed alongside entertainment and amenities. I don't intend to use commodifying as a bad word, but still. Promoters were more aware that the meetings they made were purposefully constructed. Back to the earlier Dalton K quote, "We are making a calculated effort to trade up the tourist image in Nova Scotia." However, in Quest of the Folk, Mackay described those interwar earlier promoters as not the calculating perpetrators of a hoax, but the sincere builders of a framework of interpretation. As tourism advertising professionalized, history became less of a sincere framework of interpretation, more deliberate and less innocent in a Mackay sense. I don't know if that's a word, but instead, history became a marketing tool that created authenticity in the present. Anything portrayed as defining the province was more of a tactical tool to attract tourists. Before the hiring of DKCA, the Travel Bureau printed 5 posters, approximately in 1956, which are also now held here at the Nova Scotia Archives, each with a different slogan that defined the province by many different attributes. Nova Scotia is easily reached, Nova Scotia is beautiful, Nova Scotia is friendly, Nova Scotia is fun, and Nova Scotia is busy. The last poster is notable because it includes a picture of a factory in the background, which is something that would not have been included in earlier advertisements. So the poster on the right there is the Nova Scotia is easily reached poster. It's an aerial view of the Cabot Trail that shows an open road along the coast, making the viewer feel as if they were part of the road. They were traveling it themselves. The poster shows audiences that Nova Scotia was an equal competitor with modern travel infrastructure in America, while also making Nova Scotia seem authentic. Somewhat ironically, though, the Cabot Trail in 1956 was the same one-lane dirt road, as you see there, that was built in 1932 and was not paved and made into a 2-lane highway until 1961. The poster, as you can see, doesn't hide that primitiveness, dangerousness, I guess it was dangerous. And it doesn't hide it, it's more kind of works in its favor, modern enough to be accessed in relative comfort, but also sufficiently rustic to remain authentic. We see a similar trend in the time period with the rise of living history museums. Recreated open-air museums like Upper Canada Village in Eastern Ontario or Louisbourg here in Nova Scotia gave the same illusion of a genuine historical setting while still being accessible and modern for visitors. For example, the buildings at Upper Canada Village were organized in such a way that created a smooth visitor experience, but were not arranged according to historical records. The photograph on the left is also a photograph from my grandfather's collection. He definitely did take this photograph, and he's depicted sketching, looking over into the city, which is a much nicer view than today. This is another photo. I don't know if he was on assignment or if this was sort of a personal endeavor. It's really hard to tell. But what I really noticed about this photo was that his 1950 Buick in the background there seems deliberately positioned in a face-off with the horse trying to in the opposite direction. And I thought it reminded me of this poster, that mix of old and new that creates a modern and historical Nova Scotia at the same time. So by 1963, tourism promotion had been taken to new heights with the new Nova Scotia campaign, which, as I mentioned earlier, had put 12 ads into the New Yorker throughout 1963. Campaign was completely separate from regular advertising in American magazines, which were much less frequent. In the season, spring to fall was the advertising season usually, the new Nova Scotia budget was equal to half of the entire US budget for the same time frame. So they were really putting a lot of money into these 12 ads. The advertisements were categorized in the budget as industrial advertising and were designed to shape Nova Scotia's image from a cultural anti-modernism to a province-wide engagement with nature, adventure, and new technology. In the 1963 advertising plan, Dalton K describes the campaign as a modern Nova Scotia that is optimistic, aggressive, expansive. It should give pride to Nova Scotians themselves. The strategy was also deeply political. Dalton K, as I mentioned earlier, was instrumental in Stanfield's rise to leader of the PC party. The industrial advertising done by DKCA mirrored Stanfield's key political message to renew industry in Nova Scotia by encouraging foreign investment and more state intervention and planning. In addition to the name of DKCA's advertising campaigns, the new Nova Scotia was also somewhat of a slogan for Stanfield and his promises of economic development. The Travel Bureau also made an industrial film in 1963 called The New Nova Scotia. So it's not just my clever name of the presentation, but it's a fairly common phrase for the time period. In 1957, Stanfield's government created the Industrial Estates Limited Crown Corporation, or IEL. They built or leased factories and sold them for cheap to foreign companies. They also searched for new enterprises, and by 1960, 60 firms were supported and 10,000 jobs created. In this light, these industrial advertisements heavily supported the IEL, Stanfield's politics, and Dalton K's support for those politics. Just as Dalton K had hoped Nova Scotians would be proud of the new modern Nova Scotia, the Stanfield government used the same strategy to encourage voters to feel deep pride when Volvo came to Halifax in 1963, whose legacy now seems to be held at the bottom of the Bedford Basin, where those Volvos were infamously lost at sea. This April 1963 advertisement in the New Yorker, which is publicly available through their online database, pictured the reconstructed HMCS Bounty, which was built in Nova Scotia in 1960 and used for the 1962 Marlon Brando film Mutiny on the Bounty. Oddly, or interestingly, the ship was later featured in Pirates of the Caribbean and the eternal classic, the SpongeBob SquarePants movie. The ad blends industrial past and present with 1960s Hollywood. The ad informed readers that the new Nova Scotia is flourishing, once again taking her place in world trade, as she did when her wooden ships and iron men sailed the seven seas. Also note the metaphor of Nova Scotia using the female pronoun as a ship. Ironically, the ship was never used to sail the seven seas and was owned by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. Renowned heritage scholar David Laventhal argues in his book, Possessed by the Past, that authenticity is achieved in the heritage sector when public expectations of the past are met. For DKCA and its audiences, the HMCS Bounty replica was a satisfactory representation of the past. Dalton K echoes this idea, again, in the 1963 advertising plan, writing that advertising makes a place what it is, even before the tourist season. Travel is, to a surprising degree, a preconditioned state of mind. It's a status symbol, and the agency's job was to create the preconditioned state of mind. In the United States context, this is similar to Disneyland's Main Street, which was made to be a realistic representation of turn-of-the-century America, or what Walt Disney planners refer to as Disney realism. The fictional non-location of Main Street didn't matter to the public, and it still doesn't. Similarly, the context of the HMCS Bounty as a replica for a Hollywood film prop didn't deter the Travel Board from appropriating it as a living historical symbol of Nova Scotian industry. Again, the ad still uses folk motifs, historical significance, association with long-standing quality, golden age of sail, but more really to sell Nova Scotia as a modern industrial product. These industrial ads represented also a real economic upturn in Atlantic Canada. By the 1960s, the increased expenditure on tourism came at a moment of hopefulness for regional industry that saw unemployment rates fall below the national rate and more federal investment in the region. Many of these expectations came out of the 1950s, a period that Margaret Conrad described as the Atlantic Revolution, which sought a radical revision of the nation's policies towards regional disparity. Culturally and academically, as a lot of you probably know, a new regional identity developed among academics in the 1960s that was positioned against Central Canadian presumptions. Academics like Ernie Forbes, exasperated with the ignorance of Canadian historians, Central Canadian historians, exemplified by the infamous comment by Frank Underhill in 1964 that as for the maritime provinces, nothing, of course, ever happens down there. Pretty famous, you've probably heard it. Also in 1971, we see the creation of Canadiensis, Journal of the History of Atlantic Canada. But we know that the economy of the region did not revolutionize as was hoped, but the belief that Nova Scotia and all of Atlantic Canada could have provinces that were economically on par with the rest of the country was really important for the tourism industry and provincial identity. Economic success also meant more purchasing power. Scholars argue that as all social and economic classes gain access to private affluence, consumption also gains social meaning and therefore becomes our beloved consumerism. And consumerism is heavily tied to a person's personal and social identity. For some people, this is the theory. Canadian anthropologist Grant McCaffrey writes in Culture and Consumption that consumers are looking for something they can use in their construction of new versions of the self, the family, and community. This series of ads run in the New Yorker is a good example of consumerism and the connection between consumption and social identity. The associated spending and investing in the province was associated with a happy family and a personal life. The businessman effectively became the consumer. Foundational scholar of travel and tourism, John Burry, stressed in Consuming Places that travel itself becomes a form of consumerism because our social identity has become attached to travel. I'm reminded of people sort of bragging rights, for lack of a better term, of places that they've been and sort of how many countries have you been to, this sort of thing that gives you your sort of travel total that makes you special in a sense. The ad on the left from the New Yorker on June 8, 1963, big one there, focused on the quality of life that Nova Scotia's recreational activities could provide. It encouraged consumers to connect self-identity to the consumption of leisure. Both images here are also publicly available on the New Yorker's database. The tagline for the ad on the left is an employment for his idle time, then not idly spent. Aimed at businessmen, the ad's message was also that doing business in Nova Scotia always incorporated leisure and relaxation at the same time, which probably is not true, but the selling point hinged on the gendered assumption that American businessmen had families, and secondly, that they valued small-town wholesomeness for their wives and children, whom he also made important decisions for. The New Yorker ad on the left from March 30th, 1963 read, "We love it here, as you know." I also wonder if these are real people. I highly doubt that this is really someone reporting back to family from Nova Scotia. "We love it here, as you know. It isn't just because business is flourishing. We find the environment and the pace of our daily lives just about right. As for my returning to long hours of commuting and all the frantic pressures of the past, not a chance. Anyway, the family couldn't be budged." Another ad in the same series, published on May 11, 1963, read, "Youngsters grow up knowing and experiencing all the natural wonder of the sea and land. Their future, however, lies not alone with the harvest of the land and the bounty of the ocean, for the new Nova Scotia is rapidly taking its place as a thriving industrial community. Emphasis was placed on the province's ideal environment to raise children, and Nova Scotia was equally opportune for the growth of young children and families as it was for the personal, recreational growth of adults where you could go fishing on your lunch hour." But, of course, not everyone in the 1960s was completely on board with the new advertising styles. In 1963, the Stanfield government legislated the Voluntary Planning Act, and thus the Voluntary Planning Board came to be in the same year. Voluntary planning was intended to involve business and labor in the government planning process, and to help the state develop more connections with business and therefore more money outside government. Once again, an example of Stanfield's search for economic development, new business, and industry. The committees of the Voluntary Planning Board advised the Minister of Finance on how to bring more money into the province. The Tourism Sector Committee was made up of representatives from diverse places, such as tourist associations, tourist bureaus, campgrounds, hotels, motels, restaurant and food services, craft shops, cultural industries, museums, and various federal and provincial government departments. In 1964, the committee wrote 2 reports, one that focused on the promotional services, and a second on scenery and transportation. I'm going to talk mostly about the promotional services one. Their recommendations touched on the promotional themes and strategies of the Canadian Government Travel Bureau as well as the Nova Scotia Travel Bureau. They identified these groups as wholesalers, meaning organizations that sold and assembled marketing, advertising product. The report reveals an uncomfortableness with the new themes and methods of promotion. Mainly, the committee wanted information given to visitors or immigrant businessmen from America directly from locals. For them, the widely circulated wholesale information that was happening at the time bred from misinformation. The committee did not take issue with the marketing of the province as a sellable product, rather with the missing presence of local voices. People like themselves who owned and operated hotels and attractions in Nova Scotia. They also had a problem with the amount of money being spent outside of the province on this wholesaling advertising. The committee wanted more money spent on tourism within the province, more investment to prepare the tourist stores before the season, upgrade accommodations and museums. They also wanted more practical information on opening hours, facilities, various local services like sports fields, where you could go to church on Sunday. Information like that was harder to come across. The last line of the promotional service report sums it up pretty well. If we are to advertise, then we must be prepared to tell all about Nova Scotia. And it's actually got 3 exclamation points, so they were very passionate about it. The language in the promotional services report is really similar to DKCA's advertising plans. Lines from that report included, tourists travel to see new places, new sights and scenery helps lure them, and every guide has the opportunity to sell the province's features. Although, in many ways, there was not that much consideration for local identity. They wanted local guides to see the province through the eyes of the tourist. The report posed questions such as, have you ever stopped to imagine a tourist's impression of Nova Scotia? And assumed that the guides would experience their home province, presumably their home province, like a tourism brochure. The biggest concern was definitely for the inclusion of those who operated the industry on the ground, who were ultimately responsible for meeting the tourist expectations created by these wholesaling companies. Of course, many of the people who were concerned about it were also the people that profited the most from the industry. The 1964 Promotional Services Report mentions a film about lobsters. This is most likely the Nova Scotia Travel Bureau film called Lobsters Unlimited, which was produced by Margaret Perry in 1959. It's not explicitly called out in the report, but it's almost certainly about Lobsters Unlimited. I checked, there's no other circulating film about lobsters in 1964. The report read, is our advertising not always the absolute truth, such as creating the impression, as a recent TV vehicle did, that lobsters are always available just by dipping into the water, regardless of the seasons around Nova Scotia. The Nova Scotia Travel Bureau had been making films since after the Second World War, and eventually, we talked about earlier, became the responsibility of the Nova Scotia Information Service. The film was created in 1959 and was primarily intended to promote the conservation of the valuable lobster industry, but at the time, it was also expected to be useful for tourism promotion. In the year it was released, there were 18 Travel Bureau films with a total of 5,014 screenings in the United States. The films were stored and distributed by the Canadian Travel Film Libraries of the National Film Board. DKCA started storing films in the Travel Bureau offices in 1962 and showed 78 of their on-hand films in that year. Lobsters Unlimited was shown 5 times from 1961 to 62 at the New York Travel Bureau office. Prints were also sent out from the Canadian Travel Film Library, as they have been in past years. The prints were loaned to sports clubs, church groups, television stations, and would have reached a much wider audience. From 1963 to 64, Lobsters Unlimited was aired 15 times on American television and screened to a 16mm audience 7 times. So, luckily, we've got some clips from the film, which is also held here and was graciously digitized for me by the staff here. So,
all the year round, somewhere along Nova Scotia's coast, lobstermen are trapping these curious creatures which provide a good part of the province's fishing income. But not all regions of the coast are open for lobsters all the time.
it's a long pause.
This is why there are open and closed seasons, and why the land and sea forces of the Department of Fisheries insist that the lobster fishing seasons are observed and the fishermen's multi-million-dollar industry protected. Yes, it's Lobsters Unlimited, all right. And those who love this prized delicacy of our Nova Scotia waters hope that the lobster will continue to flourish and increase and multiply.
At the beginning of the film, they spent a lot of time talking about how Nova Scotia is the shape of a lobster, which they like kind of contort the lobster to make it. It doesn't really work, but. So I read the report before I saw the film, and I expected Lobsters Unlimited to be, it's full 13 minutes, and the full 13 minutes talks about how lobsters fished, talks about how the women, the fishermen would, the things they did in the background. So it actually was quite informative, and I was really surprised because when I read the report, I thought, this is going to be like someone dipping their hand into the water and pulling out a lobster. But it wasn't as bad as I thought, or as misleading as I thought it would be. So I was kind of stumped, really. I'm not sure that the film, really made it seem like the quote, that they were like the problem that the committee had with it. But I also wondered too if it was just clips taken out of context. Maybe the end may have been a bit misleading if it wasn't in the full context. So the beginning, the narrator says, all the year round, somewhere along Nova Scotia's coast, lobstermen are trapping these curious creatures. But not all regions of the coast are open for lobsters all the time, which is kind of a double negative sort of phrase. Really, no part of the immediate coast is ever open to lobsters all the time. I'm not an expert in lobster fishing, but according to my research today, other than the long, larger coastal fishing areas on the South Shore, most lobster seasons are relatively in smaller coastal areas and primarily run in the spring. I think really the title of the film, and particularly the last section, are the most problematic. The final scene where the whole province is outlined with red lines to represent fishing areas makes it seem, as the narrator says, that it's Lobsters Unlimited, all right. So I think maybe it could have been the finer details of the messaging that was more discernible for the members of the committee, because they were the ones operating on the front lines of the tourism industry and may have spent a lot of time explaining to people why they can't get lobster in whatever region at whatever time of year. I accidentally flipped ahead to this. This is another photo that was taken by my grandfather in the 1950s. Most likely on assignment for the Travel Bureau. It looks like it easily could be. I don't know if he brought those fish at Sobeys or not. But like my grandfather and his colleagues, the Voluntary Planning Board Tourism Sector Committee didn't have a problem with making the province appealing by going to Sobeys to get the prettiest looking fish. The problem arose when there was no local consultation on how to fake the fish scene. After a very, very busy decade of tourism promotion in the 1960s, in 1971, the Travel Bureau officially became the Department of Tourism. Up until the early 1970s, tourism in North America was growing at rapid rates because of disposable income, traveling baby boomers, and transportation improvements in the 1960s, among lots of other reasons. By the 1970s, tourism growth had stalled in Nova Scotia with the increasing price of energy and transportation costs. As competition grew, the Department of Tourism began to focus on why people chose not to come to Nova Scotia, rather than making first-time visitors aware that we existed. As the tourism industry slowed down, we start to see a lot of the suggestions of the Voluntary Planning Board Tourism Committee starting to take shape. The Department of Tourism upgraded local hotel administration programs, created bursaries for tourism management programs, and incentives for renovations to tourist accommodations. So when business is not good, you start to work at home, yes. Today, interestingly, Tourism Nova Scotia's Board of Directors is governed by local stakeholders. I wanted to finish with a couple of reflections on tourism promotion as we know it today. And there's not really any answers, just things that I've been thinking about. The methods and strategies put in place by these early promoters have definitely created and formed the modern tourism industry in Nova Scotia. The content has definitely changed, though. In the 21st century, now we see more focus on the growing food and beverage industry, like craft breweries, distilleries, as continue to create connections between current day quality and imagined or real cultural tradition. For example, this ad from the 2016 Tourism Nova Scotia campaign called If You Only Knew pictured a fiddle with text up at the top there. The mix of traditional Celtic and contemporary music makes pub hopping in Halifax a must-do night out. Interestingly, this campaign focused on, and later ones, especially in this most recent tourism year, about attracting people who had never been to Nova Scotia. But in 1970s, they said, well, we've already done that, let's try to find out why people aren't coming. But now we're sort of cycled back to making people aware of Nova Scotia. We also know that tourism promotion can influence the social identity and status of locals and travelers alike. If you go into any Scottish bar on a busy night in Halifax, you'll definitely see Tartanism in action. Or think of how Instagram has become a place to brag about the social capital of having been somewhere to a recognizable destination, which arguably has become probably the most important tourism promotion in and of itself. But now that Nova Scotia is more diverse, with more immigrants from all over the world, we have a better understanding of minorities in the past and the present, we should start to think about how the industry might be holding on to bygone advertising themes developed in the mid-20th century. And I wonder, are we doing a good enough job of showcasing what Nova Scotia means to everyone in 2019? That's it.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah, for this fascinating talk. I learned a lot tonight, especially about what we especially see in the summer season every day, how tourism and promotion for tourism affects daily life and local communities here in Nova Scotia. Thank you very much for that. I open the floor to the audience. Are there any questions? Yes. Shall I use the microphone?
Please do.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
you then, yeah.
I noticed that you didn't mention the ferries and their aspect of the tourism.
Yeah, well, I don't know a whole lot about the history of the ferries in the background. You mean like the current day sort of things that are happening with the ferry from the mean, it would have been part of the same sort of efforts to attract the right people from New England to come to Nova Scotia, potentially too, as a way, alternative travel to car travel, which was, like I mentioned, in the 70s becoming more and more expensive. But I don't know a lot of the details of when it started. I went a little bit past sort of the time period that I had titled the presentation, but I didn't really, it's the sort of the post-war period up until like 1965. Anything after that, I'm not really sure.
So I really enjoyed your paper, and a quick comment and then a question, if I may. Comment is probably more of a reminiscence that at one of the very early Atlantic Canada Studies conferences, I always forget if it was 76 or 78, Dalton K was the dinner speaker at the conference, and it was sort of an interesting occasion in the sense that for some of the younger historians in attendance, we sort of thought, well, what's this about Dalton K? We associated Dalton K more with the political side of his involvement. But instead what we got was a speech that I think by the end many of us found quite inspirational, because he was so encouraging about the process of reassessing, reevaluating, even disrupting some myths and stereotypes. So to me that actually is very much in harmony with what you're arguing with respect to the agency, that again, so really changing that image that people had. So I found that really interesting and very, very, I learned from making that connection. The question, and I don't know if there's any real evidence on this or not, there may not be, but as you know, Dalton Camp has connections, very much New Brunswick connections.
Yeah.
I wonder if that had any influence on his approach to Nova Scotia. Maybe, and again I'm speculating, particularly, as we all know, the era was that of the Robichaud government with its equal opportunity program, and again really upsetting and disrupting more traditional patterns of power and understanding. And I'm just wondering to what degree Dalton K brought still a maritime, but not a Nova Scotia perspective to his work on Nova Scotia.
Yeah. I don't know exactly. He's quoted a lot in their advertising reports with these sort of really nice, sort of inspirational kind of things. I don't know. Yeah, I really don't know. I'm not sure. I kind of imagine that he was interested in Nova Scotia because he knew Stanfield and he was sort of heading towards becoming involved in politics, but I don't know what his identity as a New Brunswicker other than sort of that larger kind of the maritime kind of revolutions idea. I really don't know though, other than that, but probably.
No, thank
Yeah.
you. And as I say, it's entirely possible that the evidence on that kind of question just isn't there.
I know that he moved back to New Brunswick and he passed away in New Brunswick, and that was his sort of final kind of spot. But no, I don't know how he felt about regional identity. I don't know. You might know better. I've never seen him
Well,
speak.
no, and it's just an indication of how
Yeah.
interesting your presentation is, but I think it raises all kinds of fascinating questions with respect to some of these maritime.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. You can't have all the pictures in the slideshow. I was hoping to see the one with the factory in the background.
Oh.
And
yeah.
curious as to what that looked like. And as a little kind of comment, the view from Citadel Hill that you found comparatively pleasing does give a kind of prominent place. Isn't that the Moyer's chocolate factory? Square in the kind of center left of the, so that's a historic factory that is no longer with us.
Mm-hmm. And all those buildings along Brunswick Street there too.
Yes, I mean, those are the,
Yeah.
19th century, in fact, like, industry is there in
Right.
that photo in
Right.
a big way.
Yeah.
Anyhow,
Yeah.
did the factory in the,
Isn't that Clayton?
Is that the Clayton?
or is that the Clayton
I think it's
textile?
Is it Morris?
I think it's Warriors. I remember, I came from the valley and they used to call the downtown Halifax smell the chocolate covered fish smell. Anyhow, so, other factory in the poster.
Yeah, the poster, I do have a copy of it. They're huge. They're like the size of this table. It was really hard to take a photo of it. It's sort of a, I don't think I have it. I don't have it on my computer, but it's kind of like an abstract sort of factory. There's like a shooting. Some people in the building may have seen it before. It's clearly a factory, and there's like sort of a fire sort of sparks like coming through kind of as the aesthetic of the poster, and it's in the same font. Nova Scotia is busy. I thought the term busy rather than,
So it's an abstract painting then, not a photograph?
No, it's a photograph, but you can't, I don't know how to explain it. Like it's not a full landscape picture of a factory. It's sort of inside a factory. It's kind of like from the perspective of a worker, what they would see beneath them, sort of sparks flying and things
So
like
it's
that.
like steel mill.
Yeah.
interior.
I don't know. I think maybe the location has an idea. I'm not sure if we know where it was taken, but I'm looking at my mom because she was the one who put some of the descriptions together for me.
I think it's the cities.
Yeah.
It's Nova Scotia Steel
Yeah.
or something like that. And from my memory, I think, wasn't there a man in it with, the torch guy?
Welder.
The thing over his
Welder's
face?
mask.
Yeah.
A welder's mask.
A welder's mask, that's what it's called, yeah.
Should have included that one.
I mean, it's an odd tourist image, like it doesn't
Yeah.
suggest itself
Yeah.
obviously
Yeah.
as a tourist image.
Yeah, I probably should have. I'm gonna publish it hopefully in the journal, and it will definitely be there because it's one of the more interesting ones.
And I noticed I think it's the post office building in the center in the back there. You'd be lucky to see anything of that today.
A great presentation. Just wanted to note that back in the late 60s and 70s, when I went to work with the Nova Scotia Information Service, and we were very much involved with the old Travel Bureau. I'd like to mention some of the photographers you mentioned, obviously your grandfather, but those that I think really contributed to the not only the travel promotion but the industrial and business promotion that went on in the 60s and in the 70s when I was with the government. And to mention some of the photographers, you mentioned Margaret Perry, who I think had a great career as a filmmaker in Nova Scotia. Hedley Doty, Larry Boner, Ned Norwood, Bob Brooks. All of these had contributed to the material that Dalton K and Norm Atkins had to work with.
Of course.
And that agency, I think, brought a lot of life to the tourism promotion in Nova Scotia in the 1960s. So I just wanted to make reference to some of my former colleagues.
Yeah. Do you recognize anybody here?
Are you able to recognize anybody in the pictures?
I have to get closer.
Oh, we will get you closer. I think Larry Boner is on the right, and Margaret.
You were the next one.
Thanks. Growing up in the 70s, I always got the impression that the Rose Bowl Parade float was a big part of the Nova Scotia tourism annual budget. Do you know when that started, when Nova Scotia started to run a float in the New Year's Day Rose Bowl Parade?
I do not. I would say it was probably after the Department of Tourism was created in the 1970s. I don't know.
It's a Jerry Regan thing.
Yeah, it was Regan.
You know, the tuna cup match was in this time period. That was kind of the big event of the year. And the agencies, the earlier ones, going back into the early 1940s, they were the ones who organized it.
Okay, let's see. There was somewhere behind you. No, not anymore.
sounded very interesting, and I thought particularly interesting this kind of overlap with the political and the new, and confirms that these departments don't function in silos, that they speak to one another. But I still find it interesting, and maybe it's because you didn't show us the full picture, but if you took away the slogans, new, there's still a boat, there's still the coast, there's still the fish, in a way.
It's all still there, it's just the way that it's being packaged.
Yeah, but it's the tenacity of those images, and I found that as I did some work on Quebec, and even with La Belle Province, modernity, etc., you have the habitant in a corner.
Yeah.
And it's as if you just can't let go.
Even 2006, absolutely. Like, even in 2016, like, we still can't let it go, right?
Yeah.
It's, but then you start seeing slowly other things come into play. So you've got all these posters, and some things are what you would expect, but then you see a factory, like it's sort of, like that's where like this essentialism sort of ends. It doesn't end the folk, but the idea that the province could be more than just these 5 things, but they could still be everything at the same time.
And then also Dalton K, for me, I remember he was part of the success of Peter Zowski's Morning Side radio show, yeah.
You have to speak right into it.
I'll just speak loudly. Your, I think, third slide. That one, this one. So I was really struck when looking at this, how well these categories that you've listed here map with research that's been done on National Geographic photography.
Okay.
And the analysis of same period in its history, how National Geographic magazine shapes the really non-American world through its images. And I wondered, by looking at this, if in fact DKCA did any research with magazines such as National Geographic about the way in which it was constructing an image in the popular imagination of Nova Scotia, because I know there were articles about Nova Scotia in the magazine prior to and following their
sort of earlier than Dalton K. Like I think it's 19, I can't remember the year, but 1941 I think, that there was a full color ad in National Geographic.
No, I'm talking about articles. In the
you
magazine.
mean articles?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Not just photos or ads.
Yeah. Do you know if they did any research in their market research and all their extensive research about, what people were wanting to see? Were they looking at the way in which American media was constructing an idea of Nova Scotia in the popular imagination?
Most of the reports plans were focused on like specifically the readership and figures and these like population and median incomes and things like that. And there's not a lot of sources. Like basically, the material is here at the Provincial Archives. The things before the Department of Tourism were pretty scarce. Right. So there's the advertising plan for their second year, which is more about where to place the ads, which, there's these long analyses of like, well, TV Guide did really well this year, but Saturday Evening Post, they're going back and forth about all these sort of different factors that they're using to consider where to place the magazine, where to place the ads. But no, I don't know if there was any sort of deeper kind of research. I don't know what happened to the institutional archives of, the company still exists. It's been sold, but it wasn't sold until 1992. But I don't know, things that were not kept and held on to by the provincial government, I don't know where it exists. I don't know if any archivists here know.
I have the mic, but it's not necessarily working.
No?
But that would be a great research project.
Yeah.
So then probably shall we do it without the mic, or?
Don't need the mic though.
Yeah.
Try speaking right into it.
Yeah, like that?
Yes.
Now it works? Okay, you.
That's okay, I don't need the microphone, but, so Reg was my dad, and I can always remember my mother talking about the Wedgeport Tuna Derby International, and I think that was around the time I was born in 1957. And my mother always saying how big of a deal it was. The whole crew of these folks would go there and spend a lot of time and effort to record each derby down that way. It was apparently a pretty big thing.
Yeah, that was the big event of the year, sort of. There's the photo that we had put on Facebook was I don't know if it was taken at the Tuna Cup, but it's a picture of 3 or 4 boats and cameramen and things going on while they're all sort of around the water. But yeah.
Okay. Want the mic?
Yeah, I had filled in for 1 week when it's okay. When the photographers went up there, and I worked here in Halifax, but the expectation was if they even got like 2 pictures published in a New England newspaper, then that was worth it in advertising savings and so on. But they gave every winning fisherman a photograph of them by a tuna, and they went through hundreds of 8x10 glosses in the run of a week, just to get the few pictures published in a New England newspaper.
Yeah, the amount of work that went into it just for a handful of.
Yeah.
As I understand it, one is a particular presentation of Nova Scotia by the Nova Scotia Travel Bureau, for the most part in-house, until the hiring of Camp and Associates, a firm with strong conservative connections, which was given a very large budget. I wonder whether there were any tensions between the people in the Nova Scotia Travel Authority who had been responsible for this before, when this new presentation was made by Camp and Associates with a large amount of money, presumably working with the Nova Scotia Travel Bureau. Were there any tensions between the people who had been there and these individuals who had been brought in by the Stanfield government to re-engineer an approach to Nova Scotia?
That's what I had thought at first, was that I'm going to find this story of tension between this Central Canadian company that's coming in to but it wasn't really like that. It was welcome. The voluntary planning board. Like I said, they didn't have problems with the way that it was promoted, but less local consultation and not spending enough money at home. So in that sense, yes, but actually the actual work between the Travel Bureau and the new agency, from what I can tell, is not strained. It's not mentioned in the annual reports for the department. You would never know. But earlier firms that had worked with the Travel Bureau, they worked really closely together. So it was almost as if they were all part of the same team. So as far as I can tell, there were no tensions. It seemed to be pretty harmonious.
There was continuity in this staff in the Travel Bureau?
Yeah, and even the bureaus in New York, the advertising agency, Kelly Nason, the one that had been working for the bureau before, they continued to operate it for a year after DKCA was hired, because they were already set up and established, and it had been in their offices in New York. So the transition was joint in a way, it wasn't an abrupt sort of switch. Yeah, from what I can tell, it was a pretty welcome relationship.
Okay, are there any further questions?
Do you have any sense of whether Dalton Camp is just a name and there's other people who know marketing who actually do these things?
Yes.
Or does Dalton actually, this political science, this journalist and guy who studied Ken Leslie, how is he marketing that?
He's not, the reports are all written sort of the royal we sort of the agency, but there's mention of, Dalton sends his regrets, he can't be here for the meeting and things like that. And he seems to be more sort of the figurehead of the organization. In terms of what he actually, work that he did and how he was, I don't know for sure, but he definitely seems to be sort of the rallying figure who says, really inspiring things once a year and then sort of backs away and lets the agency do the advertising. But other than, I don't know for sure though. Oh, that's sort of.
Yeah, can you separate out the impact of the campaign, the Dalton Camp campaign, versus just the increase in tourism that was occurring internationally, transportation was more accessible and so on, the degree to which the campaign itself actually increased tourism. I mean, Babe Ruth was coming up to Nova Scotia in the 50s. It was out there as an interesting place to come. Can you actually have a metric that would say that the advertising campaign boosted it by so much, or is that just possible?
Yeah, probably. I mean, they record how many people come into the province every year, and it increases every year. There's a yearly increase in budget, and people.
Was there a bump? Was there a bump after the Dalton campaign? Or?
In terms of money, it wasn't actually that big of a jump, really.
Yeah.
Like tourism and also cars entering. Like it was fairly steady. It wasn't sort of a sudden kind of revival in terms of people coming to the province. But then, yeah, in the 1970s, it sort of starts to dip off again, largely because of other factors. But no, I don't know how many businessmen moved to Nova Scotia because of that campaign in the New Yorker, but yeah, I don't know. Again, it's like it's not really mentioned in the annual reports for the department. It's not very transparent that this agency is working with the government, the Travel Bureau. So it's hard to tell.
Are there any further questions or comments? No, if that is not the case, then please join me in to say thank you to Sara for this great and before we go to the shedding, we meet again on Wednesday, October 23rd at 7 p.m. for, I'm really looking forward to that one, for a talk of Heidi MacDonald from the University of New Brunswick, St. John, about the long and contentious road to women's suffrage in Nova Scotia. I hope that many of you can come and have a pleasant evening and come home safely.